Hey guys, welcome back to Listen Chum for a new video, this time on the war with Iran. As you may have noticed, the Americans, despite the abundance of force projection capabilities, didn't particularly show any coherence or planning in this war. Here I'll be comparing it to the Persian Gulf War of 1991, which had a lot of similarities with the current war. Both happened in the same region, Iran and Iraq are neighbors, with access to the same waterway, economies based on all experts, with authoritarian regimes which supported terrorism and wanted weapons of mass destruction. In fact, Iraq already had some at the time. In both cases, the US led a war against them with a sustained air campaign for several weeks, and an asymmetrical warfare response by the regimes, hard to counter. Despite the similarities, the Gulf War was much better managed, with good US leadership, clear objectives, international legality, and ended in a decisive victory despite less advanced technology. We'll see here how and why the 1991 war succeeded, while Trump's war was a series of issues. I'll start first with the background for each war. Saddam Hussein's Iraq was a bloody, crappy dictatorship which killed thousands of people on sectarian grounds, tortured many in atrocious ways, and gassed tens of thousands. It was a militaristic secular regime which used religion as a front. Saddam supported terrorist groups in the region against neighbors and especially against Israel, which he viewed as his number one enemy. Saddam had an elaborate weapons of mass destruction program, with chemical weapons used against his population and against Iran, a biological program, as well as a very elaborate nuclear program. Iraq had a nuclear reactor which was destroyed by Israel in 1981, but then by 1991 was on its way to build a new one. Saddam Hussein in 1980 began a war against Iran. Because Iran was an enemy of the United States, Iraq was seen as a counterweight and received some military intelligence from Washington. Washington hoped that relations with Saddam would reduce his authoritarianism and bring him into the international community. Despite that, the dictator persisted, used combat gas against Iran, and the war ended in 1988 in a status quo after hundreds of thousands of deaths. Saddam, after the war, saw himself as a regional hero against Iran and wanted his regional neighbors, especially his small neighbor Kuwait, to pay for his war debts. Of course, they refused, and he believed in a conspiracy against him by the Americans, the Zionists, and his rich neighbors. Iraq at the time had an enormous army and a staggering economy, a dangerous mix. The US had underestimated Baghdad's aggressivity, which notably threatened to destroy Israel with missiles and invade Kuwait. During the summer of 1990, Saddam calculated that the time was right for him to take his small rich neighbor while the Americans were distracted by the end of the Cold War and thought he would only face complaints. The Iraqi army began invading Kuwait on August 2, 1990, with armored divisions and commandos. More than 1,000 civilians were killed, and several thousand foreigners were taken hostage and sent to strategic military sites as human shields. Not ideal for attracting international sympathy. Iran, meanwhile, used to be an ally of the US in Israel, with its leader the Shah Pahlavi until 1979. The Shah had a bad image, and poor economic conditions led to his downfall. He was toppled by a revolution led by several groups and coordinated by the Ayatollah Khomeini. The Islamic Republic was proclaimed on April 1st, and the new regime discarded its former leftist allies. Women's rights were diminished, and militias enforced religious law. Israel and the United States were now Iran's two biggest enemies, and their embassies were stormed. The Iranians took 66 American diplomats hostage, and Washington had lots of trouble getting them home. That was a humiliation never forgotten, especially by Trump. Iran is also a crappy dictatorship which, instead of gassing its citizens, still massacred thousands as we saw this year. During the war with Iraq, they used the excuse to begin a bloody repression campaign. There were still elections, and we even had in 1997 a reformist president elected, but he was powerless. The Ayatollah held the real power, and candidates for all elections had to be pre-approved by the Guardian Council. Newspapers which offended the Islamic principles were closed. Iranian secret services killed secular leaders and dissidents in the country or abroad. There's obviously lots of electoral fraud, and to protest against this led to many deaths. As for its foreign relations, as I said, the enemy is Washington and Israel, and the country was for the most since 1979 under US sanctions. Tehran was greatly involved in regional conflicts by supporting terrorist groups like the Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Hamas in Palestine, the Houthis in Yemen, and in Iraq the Al-Sadr group and the Badr organization. Destroying Israel is a state goal because of anti-Semitism, of anti-Zionism, and because of how the Israelis treated the Palestinians. The Islamic regime always opposed the peace process between the Palestinians and Israel and favored violence, first by supporting groups, then since 2024 by directly shooting at Israel. One factor is the religious dimension. Shia Muslims believe that the Mahdi, an immortal prophet living in hiding since the 9th century, will come to save them during a period of destructive conflict and bring the world towards a Muslim kingdom. The Iranian clergy believes in this and sees destroying Israel as a step towards fulfilling the prophecy, which is why many fear a nuclear-armed Iran. Iran also wants nuclear weapons for deterrence and protecting the regime, although it's not entirely clear to what extent they follow a rational paradigm. The Iranian nuclear program was hidden from the world for years. The American administration under Obama obtained an agreement in 2015 on this issue, where Iran gave large concessions, but Trump withdrew from it in 2018, saying it didn't work. In 2025, the International Atomic Energy Agency declared that Iran was in breach of non-proliferation treaties. Immediately after, in June, the Israelis led a 12-day war in Iran with precision strikes on nuclear and missile sites, with a last-minute American assistance. Trump meanwhile has kept the same optics since the 1980s, with his affinity with Russia and tariffs, a disdain for NATO, and his will to avenge the Iran hostage humiliation. Already in the 80s, he talked about stopping defending Japan and the Saudis, and said that troops should have been sent to take Iranian oil reserves. We thus have relatively similar context for Iran and Iraq, except that it was Iraq in 1990 which initiated the war, and not Iran in 2026, and that would be a major difference. The blatant and anachronistic invasion of Kuwait allowed Washington to firmly respond and assemble an international coalition. As much as the American administration had been clumsy with Iraq in the past, now the Bush government was very clear and resolute, saying on the 5th,
"This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait."
Bush worked to organize international sanctions with a diplomatic offensive. The UN Security Council voted on the 6th for a commercial and financial embargo, which made Iraq lose 90% of its imports, all of its exports, and half of its GDP. Even China and the USSR cut their weapons deliveries. Saddam though never backed down, thinking he could hold. Saddam had miscalculated. He underestimated American will, did not recognize the good atmosphere among world countries at the time, exacerbated things with hostages, made the world fear for oil flows, and gave the impression of preparing to invade Saudi Arabia. His forces were entrenched along the Saudi border, and the Americans quickly initiated Operation Desert Shield for building up troops fast to deter him. American objectives became clearer in the next months: to expel invaders from Kuwait and reduce Iraqi capacity to attack neighbors in the future. Given American power, this could look easy, but they needed to bring many units based in Europe and the Pacific, and they needed for that an airplane and ship armada. Thanks to American diplomacy, 38 nations offered to send troops, including Arab countries, 12 offered financial help, and even the Soviets stayed on the sides. The United Nations in November authorized the use of force against Iraq if Saddam did not withdraw from Kuwait by February 15, 1991. The Iraqi dictator of course refused, seeing Western diplomacy as a sign of weakness. For military planning, yes, the coalition had large military means, but the task was still difficult. There were few experts on the region in the US command. Iraq at the time had the fourth army in the world, with an enormous support infrastructure, hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks, around 750 planes, and most of all an enormous and complex anti-air system. The Iraqis though were mostly a tactical army with emphasis on decisive battles rather than on complex operational and strategic notions. They had established in Kuwait 3 lines of defense with minefields and an abundance of artillery. Saddam thought he could make the Americans abandon due to losses. On the US side, President Bush obtained from Congress on January 7 authorization of military means to force Iraq out of Kuwait. Polls show that the vast majority of Americans were behind the war. Now it was about winning it. American forces had rebuilt since Vietnam, both in terms of equipment and strategic doctrine. It was decided to launch an air campaign lasting several weeks, followed by a land campaign. The Americans wanted to tie the coalition together and work to keep Israel out of the conflict. On January 9, the Iraqis in a diplomatic meeting again taunted the rest of the world. War was unavoidable, and Washington was prepared at almost all levels. As former Secretary of Defense Weinberger said in 1984, policies formed without a clear understanding of what we hope to achieve would earn us the scorn of our troops, who would have an understandable opposition to being used in every sense of the word. If we do decide to commit forces to combat overseas, we should have clearly defined political and military objectives. And we should know precisely how our forces can accomplish those clearly defined objectives. This would exactly be the case in 1991, and almost not in the current war with Iran. For the war with Iran, there was almost nothing clear. There hasn't been an invasion by the Iranians, no great cause for international justice, only a distant threat. The US and Israel began the hostilities, which is illegal according to the UN Charter. It's hard in these conditions to assemble an international coalition, but we could argue that Bush Jr. in 2003 managed to assemble a decent coalition to invade Iraq. Here, the Trump administration didn't even try. They just collaborated with Israel without ever notifying other allies. Their justification was military secrecy, and indeed, the more communications with allies, the more a risk of leak. But here they had a massive fleet approaching, detected for a long time, so you wonder at what extent surprise was important. Iran was expecting a war and had amplified its oil production in anticipation. We see two things here. That Trump didn't fear bringing Israel in a war against a Muslim country, contrarily to 1991, and most of all, Trump was extremely contradictory on the necessity of allies for help. I made here a graph summarizing chronologically his declarations, going from "we don't need allies" to "it would be great if they help" to "why aren't they helping?" Good war management depends on clear objectives, like in 1991. In 2026, the American objectives, which didn't change from the beginning, was preventing Iran from having nuclear weapons. But on one side, the president declared that his 2025 bombings on nuclear sites were a tremendous success. Everything is a tremendous success for him. That they had obliterated the nuclear program. And on the other hand, he justifies the war by talking about preventing Iran from accessing the 440 kilos of uranium buried underground. Another objective was destroying missiles and other means of Iranian projection, but on this the priorities changed. What varied the most was the question of regime change. At the beginning, Trump said that it wasn't a priority, then after a few days with the euphoria, they talked about an unconditional Iranian surrender and regime change, with government spokesmen trying to mitigate and relativize. At some point, Trump began saying that the regime had been changed and was different, which is completely false. Trump never tried to rally people behind his objectives. He followed the Lyndon Johnson pattern as in Vietnam by trying to minimize the war by talking about a short excursion. While in 1991 they talked about the major Iraqi threat and were surprised of success, here they constantly minimized the extent of the war and Iran was more resilient than anticipated. With the evolution of the war, they also had as an important objective reopening the Strait of Hormuz, which was never reached. At the geopolitical analysis level, many said that the objective for Trump was weakening Russia and especially China. Except that as we saw, Trump remains affectionate of Russia, high oil prices helped Moscow, and the American president exempted the Russians from some oil sanctions. For China, some argue that the war aims to drain its strategic oil reserves. China is indeed Iran's largest oil customer, and the US blockade on Iran, which was implemented very late and in an improvised manner, could have hurt it in the long term. Except that the blockade did allow several tankers going to China, while US allies like South Korea had to pay Iran to pass Hormuz. After that, China has strategic reserves amounting to 1.3 billion barrels, the largest in the world, and only began using them in May at a rate of 1 million barrels per day. To empty those reserves would have taken much longer than Trump's patience. Moreover, an Iran which keeps harassment capabilities remains a Chinese win. For the Israelis, meanwhile, the objectives included the same as the Americans, but in a much more rigorous and systematic manner. Focus here was on regime change, because they know the regime will always try to rebuild strike capabilities dedicated to destroying Israel. Operation Desert Storm began with a very elaborate and well-coordinated air campaign lasting 6 weeks. They faced the Iraqi Air Force, sixth in the world, but which had less trained pilots than in the West, and of the 750 planes, 68 were fourth generation and 186 third generation. They had 54 air bases, but the coalition systematically targeted them, and Iraqi aviation never was a big problem. The largest threat was the anti-air system, among the most dangerous in the world. They had tens of thousands of surface-to-air missiles with radar or thermal guidance, and 7,500 anti-air guns, including several thousands around Baghdad. They had a variety of short and long-range radars, sometimes impossible to scramble, as well as the CARI defense coordination system built by the French. Their system had been dispersed as much as possible in anticipation of war. Long-range weapons were neutralized quickly, but short-range ones remained dangerous until the end. Coalition air planning had 5 objectives: isolate and incapacitate the regime, gain and maintain air supremacy, destroy Iraqi WMD means, destroy their offensive capabilities, and render Iraqi armed forces ineffective. They divided targets in 12 categories, with 8 strategic target categories. The air campaign would be in 4 phases: a strategic campaign, an air superiority campaign with eliminating anti-air defenses, then reducing ground forces effectiveness, and finally ground support for the ground war. They had for that 2,700 aircraft, including the new stealth planes F-117, as well as the new ship-launched Tomahawk missiles. The air campaign's implementation was done with unprecedented finesse for the time, and even for today. There were 1,000 sorties the first night, with only a single plane lost. The F-117s led raids on Baghdad with guided munitions. There were munitions called Kit 2, dropping carbon strings to short-circuit electrical installations without destroying them. The British had specialized munitions for destroying airfields, but had to stop low-altitude strikes due to defenses. The Iraqis had 600 reinforced bunkers in the country, and 2 precision bombs were needed to destroy each of them, which was accomplished with ease. Iraq decided to send its planes to Iran to save them from destruction. Coalition air superiority was assured in only 3 days. In 3 weeks of bombings, the aviation had bombed the electrical network, Saddam's secret services, communications, many bridges, all at a low cost. Saddam didn't fall, however, and Iraq didn't seek peace. Strategic bombings on Iraqi oil, with 90% of infrastructures destroyed, didn't have an impact in such a short time. There were still disagreements and rivalries among American forces, with aviators saying they could win by themselves, and ground officers who wanted more focus on entrenched Iraqi forces. There were 35,000 strikes on them. Aviators had become very good at destroying enemy tanks. Despite that, it was evident that the ground campaign was needed in February to finish the war. There had been during the war 116,000 sorties, as well as 288 Tomahawks and 35 ACLMs fired. What really distinguished the air war in 1991 was the level of precision in strikes, notably with smart guided bombs. Some smart bombs could target very specifically with a few meters accuracy, but of 88,500 tons of bombs dropped on Iraq, less than 10% were smart. They were mostly used on strategic targets, notably in urban settings, to avoid civilian losses. To give you an idea, in Normandy in 1944, there was a civilian killed per 4 tons of bombs dropped. In Vietnam, a civilian for 15 tons, and in the Gulf for 38 tons. Around 2,300 Iraqi civilians were killed by the bombings in 6 weeks of war, which is very little. There was, however, a blunder on February 13, which was hard to avoid. The Al-Firdos bunker in Baghdad was, according to US intelligence, used by Iraqi forces because it was the same type of bunker used in normal time, it was camouflaged, communications emanated from it, military vehicles were parked in front, and Iraqi intelligence was nearby, except that in reality it was a bunker used by civilian families of government members. 200 to 300 people, mostly women and children, died in a terrible way. The Iraqis, of course, spoke about a premeditated and criminal attack, but of course it wasn't. Still, the Americans wanted to avoid a new scandal and sharply reduce strikes on Baghdad. In the meantime, Saddam Hussein was committing real crimes, notably by destroying 732 Kuwaiti oil wells, burning up to 5 million barrels per day. It took thousands of firefighters for 8 months after to extinguish everything. He also ordered the spilling of 4 to 6 million barrels on the Kuwaiti coast on January 25, and it took a coalition strike to cut the terminal. Saddam also placed military headquarters in places of worship, schools and hospitals, and placed some airplanes next to houses knowing that the coalition wouldn't bomb them. The coalition's air campaign managed to severely weaken Iraqi forces, but there remained the ground campaign to end the war. For Operation Epic Fury, the US-Israeli campaign against Iran, obviously I don't have access to archives on political or military decisions. We can only do with what we have. Forces involved in 2026 were different than in 1991. Iran's aviation was relatively weaker than Saddam's, with most of its planes dating from before the revolution, and others like MiG-29s were Iraqi planes which took refuge in 1991. Of 400 estimated Iranian planes, around 150 were operational. Even then, they posed a much smaller threat than Iraqi aviation. The Americans and Israelis meanwhile had at all time around 400 planes, all modern, including many stealth F-22s and F-35s. The Israelis took the route over Syria, while the Americans had bases in Kuwait, Jordan, and the UAE, and brought 2 aircraft carrier groups, and since March 3. While in 1991 they had less than 10% of munitions guided, it was 68% for the Iraq War of 2003, and here in 2026 it was practically 100%. They mostly used JASSMs, long-range and costly air-to-surface missiles, as well as JDAMs, standard bombs modified for guidance. There were also 1,400 fire Tomahawks, as well as ATACMS from the ground. Against that, the Iranian air defense system was probably weaker than Saddam's, with much less AA guns, especially around Tehran, where the attackers could strike with impunity. Even non-stealth planes were a little hit. Targets in Iran included the anti-air system, communications, logistics centers, airfields, the leadership, weapons factories, and missile launchers. There were also strikes on police stations in the west of the country for helping a possible Kurdish offensive which never materialized. Again here, the air campaign, which began on February 28, was well executed, but now we didn't expect less. The Supreme Guide Khamenei was killed on the first day in a precision strike. Trump said that the regime had changed with his death, but doesn't realize that the regime is a well-anchored institution. General Kane, US Chief of Staff, declared air superiority on March 2. At the time of the ceasefire on April 8, the Americans had led 10,200 sorties and struck 13,000 targets according to them. The most impressive were the Israelis, as much as in June 2025. With the quality of their intelligence, they could lead targeted assassinations like on Khamenei, but also on the Assembly of Experts in Qom, which notably elects the next leader. Here numbers are not always clear. Some talk about 8,500 Israeli sorties, others of 1,000. But in any case, targeted assassinations were Israel's strength and fitted in their regime change imperatives. Much less planes were down in combat here than in 1991. Here the number is 42 planes lost or damaged, mostly damaged, including in bases in neighboring countries. An F-15 was down over Iran with its 2 crew members. A search and rescue operation was executed brilliantly to save them, notably with an improvised airstrip on the spot. President Trump was, according to reports, hysterical during the event, always thinking in terms of public opinion and midterms, but this is not unprecedented. Lyndon Johnson for Vietnam was a pretty terrible commander-in-chief, also disrespecting military leaders, and mostly thought in electoral terms. There was also in the Iran War a major case of collateral victims, which led to a minor scandal. Here, a strike was supposed to target an Iranian intelligence building, but instead hit a school on the other side of the street. This killed around 156 people, including 120 children according to Iran, an unverified number. It's the kind of mistake which happens in war, it's sad to say, but the worst about it was the Trump administration's reaction, which denied any wrongdoing and even said it could be an Iranian strike. The Trump administration was mostly incoherent on the war's progress. I read every Truth Social post on the war by the president, around 12,000 words in total, as well as many declarations by him and Secretary Hexet to create this graph. So here are two curves, in orange for when the war will be won militarily, and in blue when the conflict in general will be over, be it in a long time, we don't know, soon, so a matter of weeks, imminent, so a matter of days, or it's already won. I can add the timeline for the conflict in reference. What I find the funniest is when they contradict each other on the same day, and sometimes by a wide margin. Notice that for military victory, it took them only 2 weeks to proclaim victory and keep saying it, while for the end of the conflict, it changed constantly. While I'm at it, I think it's worth comparing declarations by the two US presidents on the two wars, with a Bush showing finesse and humility in a superb situation, and a Trump always boastful in an incoherent situation.
No one commits America's armed forces to a dangerous mission lightly, but after perhaps unparalleled international consultation and exhausting every alternative, it became necessary to take this action. And let me tell you why.
Essentially, I did what no other president was willing to do. They made mistakes, and I am correcting them.
Let me make clear what I mean by the region's stability and security. We do not seek the destruction of Iraq, its culture, or its people. Rather, we seek an Iraq that uses its great resources not to destroy, not to serve the ambitions of a tyrant, but to build a better life for itself and its neighbors.
We're going to hit them extremely hard over the next 2 to 3 weeks. We're going to bring them back to the Stone Ages where they belong.
I'm asking the oil companies to do their fair share. They should show restraint and not abuse today's uncertainties to raise prices.
So to those countries that can't get fuel, many of which refuse to get involved in the decapitation of Iran, we had to do it ourselves. I have a suggestion. Number one, buy oil from the United States of America. We have plenty. We have so much. And number two, build up some delayed courage. Should have done it before. Should have done it with us, as we asked. Go to the Strait and just take it. Protect it. Use it for yourselves. Iran has been essentially decimated. And in any event, when this conflict is over, the Strait will open up naturally. It'll just open up naturally.
Standing up for our principles will not come easy. It may take time and possibly cost a great deal. But we are asking no more of anyone than of the brave young men and women of our armed forces and their families.
So we're winning very decisively. We're way ahead of schedule. Our military is the greatest in the world, with the greatest equipment and the greatest people in the world. Nobody's ever seen anything like it.
It is important, however, to keep in mind two things. First, this effort will take some time. Saddam Hussein has devoted nearly all of Iraq's resources for a decade to building up this powerful military machine. And we can't expect to overcome it overnight, especially as we want to minimize casualties to the U.S. and coalition forces and to minimize any harm done to innocent civilians.
I call it a skirmish because that's what it is. It's a skirmish. And we're doing unbelievably well, as we did in Venezuela, where it was rapid, over in one day. And we're doing pretty much equally as well, I would say, larger.
And second, we must be realistic. There will be losses. There will be obstacles along the way. And war is never cheap or easy. And I say this only because I am somewhat concerned about the initial euphoria in some of the reports and reactions to the first day's developments. no one should doubt or question the ultimate success, because we will prevail. But I don't want to see us get overly euphoric about all of this.
The whole world is watching, and they can't leave the power, strength, and brilliance. They just can't believe what they're seeing. They leave it to your imagination, but they can't believe what they're seeing, the brilliance of the United States military.
This is the burden of leadership and the strength that has made America the beacon of freedom in a searching world.
In America, as it has been for 5 years under my presidency, is winning, and now winning bigger than ever before.
What worked the best for Iraq, and Iran took notes, was asymmetric warfare with ballistic missiles. Before the Gulf War, it was known that Saddam Hussein had his famous Scuds, but estimates varied from 3 to 700. The Iraqis had 28 fixed platforms which were quickly targeted, but the real threat was 225 mobile launchers which could fire before hiding. With the beginning of the war, Saddam wanted to fire on Israel, well, for the sake of it, but also to make it join the war effort to fracture the coalition. The Americans managed to keep Israel out of the war by giving them Patriot missile defense batteries and promising to find the Scuds. Saddam also fired some on Saudi Arabia, notably with one on February 25 which killed 28 and injured 98. 42 missiles were fired during the war. The coalition managed to slow the number of launches but not stop them, despite 2,500 dedicated air sorties. There were 600 Patriot missiles deployed in total for the defense of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Israel. The problem was that the Scuds were modified and tended to disintegrate in atmospheric re-entry, so the Patriots went after the fragments. Intercept rates remain controversial. The Iranians learned a lesson. If their conventional air forces were inferior to Saddam's, their asymmetric warfare means were largely superior. It's very hard though to talk about numbers for the missile and drone capabilities at the beginning. They had between 2,500 and 4,000 missiles at the beginning of the war and thousands of drones. They even established drone factories in Tajikistan in case theirs were destroyed. As soon as the war started, they did like Saddam but much bigger, with dozens or even hundreds of strikes each day on Israel and Gulf neighbors. This graph for Gulf countries doesn't show it, but there were 650 missiles and 765 drones fired at Israel too. The objective was intimidating neighbors, hurt the Israelis, spread chaos, and drain US and Israeli interceptor capabilities, destruct oil infrastructure, desalination plants, electrical infrastructure, residential buildings, and American bases. So at the same time they were complaining of the accidental strike on the school, the Iranians were striking civilian buildings in countries who didn't attack them. The Americans lacked defenses and had to get anti-air batteries in Asia. They never talked before the war with the Ukrainians, who now have an expertise in drone warfare, to help with the defenses. The Americans even said they had been surprised by the Shahed drones, which yet had been a very high-profile drone used by the Russians in Ukraine. For the question of missiles and defenses, from the beginning we heard reports in the media that one side or the other would soon run out. Until now this was proven false, and munition stocks are very well hidden information for each country. It's hard to trust anonymous sources. This information is very compartmentalized and very few people know all the facts on their own country. So we see that in both cases, despite defenses, Iraq and Iran fully use their asymmetric warfare capabilities to harass their enemies and cause damage, mostly symbolic but still important. For the Gulf War, the naval aspect was pretty minor. Saddam's fleet in 1991 was minimal, with small attack boats, landing craft, and mining boats. His fleet was destroyed in a few days. The main threat came from minefields, which were far from the coast and varied. The Iraqis had put 1,167 mines, going from First World War vintage to modern ones. The Americans, British, Saudis, and Belgians participated in demining. It proved to be the coalition's weakest side, by lack of information, with notably 2 American ships damaged. This prevented some World War II US battleships to help in the bombings like they should, but they still managed to fire 1,100 shells in support. For Iran, the naval aspect is much more complex and interesting. In short, Iran had a true fleet, with frigates, corvettes, submarines, a tanker converted into a mobile base, a drone carrier, and a fast attack boat fleet. The biggest problem came from Iran's ability to block the Strait of Hormuz with the threat from drones, missiles, and mines. 20% of world oil passes through there, as well as lots of fertilizer. The Iranians began a blockade at the beginning of the war, illegally according to international law, in which essentially paralyzed trade in the region and sharply raised oil prices, with long-term impacts. The US ended up imposing a distant blockade on Iran on April 13. This blockade was legal in terms of international law because it was against a belligerent, but this was again something managed in an incoherent manner by the Trump administration. For analyzing this, I refer to Julian Corbett, a British naval theorist who published his excellent book in 1911, and personally my favorite in the field. As Corbett said, at sea it's not so much a question of territorial conquest, but rite of passage. The sea can be a means of communication as much as a barrier, and naval warfare aims to master communications at sea. One goal of naval warfare is command of the sea, meaning putting it out of the enemy's power to use effectually the common communications or materially to interfere with our use of them. For those who don't have the means of securing command of the sea, they will try to keep it in dispute, notably with active defenses and minor counterattacks, to prevent their enemy from doing what he wants. That's what Iran did. They don't have means of mastery over the Persian Gulf, but could prevent others from doing so. Hormuz is Iran's card in the conflict, and has been for decades, yet we got the impression that the Americans were not prepared. They immediately asserted that yes, they took that into account, and it would not be closed for a long time. However, a few months prior, the Americans retired their 4 Avenger-class demining ships stationed in Bahrain, there specifically against the Iranian threat, and during the war, only in April 2 were sent. Other US demining ships sent were converted LCS. As Corbett said, even more important than naval warfare was economic pressure, to attack the finances of the enemy. We want to inflict enough damage on his trade to make him seek for peace. This is again what Iran did at the beginning with oil prices and why they attacked Gulf neighbors. The Americans meanwhile didn't strike Iranian economic infrastructures, didn't take Kharg Island where 90% of Iranian oil goes through, and waited until April 13 for a blockade on Iran. The American blockade, as we saw, wasn't perfect and let some ships pass, notably to China. Estimates on Iranian resilience diverged. Some said that Iranian oil revenue in May were 84% lower than in March, while CIA leaks estimated that Iran could still withstand this for months. Corbett said that when command of the sea is in dispute, we can arrive at the stable balance, with no side strong enough to dominate. Preponderance doesn't only depend on strength, but on the relation between strength with naval positions, so bases and commercial terminals, the situation itself, and objectives for the war or campaign. That's the situation we had. Trump constantly reminded the world that the Iranian high seas fleet was destroyed, congrats, but the Iranians still managed by asymmetric warfare to keep the strait in dispute. The Americans didn't keep their fleet close to ensure stability, they kept it hundreds of miles away to stay far from threats. Trump boasted about this convoy operation Project Freedom on May the 4th, but it only lasted 24 hours with one passage. As Corbett underlined, it's generally in the interest of the more powerful nation to seek a decision event to end the conflict, and the most drastic mean is destroying enemy means of interfering. These means here were Iranian asymmetric means, the drones and missiles and small boats. Except that to entirely stop them, it would have taken a land intervention, either to hold the coast or to change the regime, which either way would have taken months of preparation. As Corbett said, the weaker side would normally try to avoid or delay a decision in hopes of restoring balance with minor operations. So we see that the situation for the United States was pretty hard, that Iran played its cards fully, and that the lack of coherence by the Trump administration made things worse. On the other side, for the Gulf War in 1991, naval warfare was a less important factor, but perfectly coherent for the coalition strategy. The Gulf War ended with a clear and decisive victory for the coalition, but still with some negative repercussions. After 180 days of maritime interdiction and 38 days of air bombings, the final phase of Desert Storm began. The objectives were to kick Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, destroy the Republican Guard in this theater, and restore Kuwait's legitimate government. There were hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of armor on each side, but coalition forces were much better trained, equipped, led, and motivated. The Marines attacked in the morning of February 24 directly towards Kuwait, so 7 Corps in the west could begin a hook maneuver and isolate and destroy Iraqi forces. Eventually, the Marines' progress was so fast that 7 Corps had to begin its move earlier. The Iraqis were in disarray and never expected an attack from the western desert. With the Marines approaching the capital of Kuwait, Iraqi soldiers fled the city in cars loaded with stolen goods. The aviation pounded them with almost 1,500 destroyed vehicles and 200 to 300 Iraqis killed. Media reports greatly exaggerated the event though. US Chief of Staff Powell feared the impact on American public opinion and wanted to end the war as soon as possible. For the men on the ground, however, nothing was over and the enemy was still defending. It was decided to end the war after 100 hours of ground combat, an arbitrary number destined for PR. Several elite Iraqi divisions of the Republican Guard managed to escape though, with 842 tanks. Still, the Iraqi army had been badly mauled and couldn't pose a regional threat. The war's aims were reached, and there was never a question of going further into Iraq. The Iraqi army went from 70 divisions to 31, including the Republican Guard from 12 to 7. Many were unsatisfied because the Americans tend to think in terms of total victory like in World War II. Here there was a ceasefire, but with Saddam still in power and much of his forces remaining. Most wars are not total wars. This war was also unprecedented in terms of low losses for the coalition. For the Americans it was 613 losses, including 146 killed in combat and 467 wounded. For the rest of the coalition, 98 died. Even with such a resounding military victory, President Bush remained humble.
7 months ago, America and the world drew a line in the sand. We declared that the aggression against Kuwait would not stand. And tonight, America and the world have kept their word. This is not a time of euphoria, certainly not a time to gloat, but it is a time of pride. Pride in our troops, pride in the friends who stood with us in the crisis, pride in our nation, and the people whose strength and resolve made victory quick, decisive, and just. No one country can claim this victory as its own. It was not only a victory for Kuwait, but a victory for all the coalition partners. This is a victory for the United Nations, for all mankind, for the rule of law, and for what is right.
If we compare that with Trump again.
It's incredible. We wiped out a big Navy, very powerful Navy. You know, these were ships, these were serious ships. These were ships that you buy when you want to win battles. We've had tremendous success. But while we're doing all of these things, we're achieving major strides toward completing our military objective. And some people could say they're pretty well complete. We've wiped every single force in Iran out very completely.
The war had cost the Americans $61 billion, but financial contributions from other countries amounted to more than $53 billion. The war had demonstrated the strengths of Reagan's military buildup, such as precision technologies, and also its weaknesses, such as the lack of demining equipment at sea and on land, and the lack of transport vehicles. The end of the war mostly showed the need to plan for the following piece. The administration was completely unprepared for the situation. Powell and the White House had decided to end the war based on initial information fragments. Iraqi forces that escaped would take part in repressing the Shia and Kurds, with thousands of deaths again, leading to international sanctions, no-fly zones, and other measures during the 1990s. For the war with Iran, by the time I'm filming this on July 5, the conflict is not totally over. Iran surprised the Americans by the regime's ability to stay in power and by unpredictable decisions. The Trump administration committed the classic McNamara or Harriman type of mistake by thinking adversaries would analyze the situation just like them. Trump also constantly referenced Maduro's capture in Venezuela as a model to replicate, But here it was a completely different situation. Because since the beginning it was completely incoherent and improvised, the war was unpopular. From a tactical and operational point of view, Epic Fury was a success, and we didn't expect less, but strategically it was chaos. There was no grand campaign here for ending the war, because Trump wanted to avoid a large campaign for electoral reasons. It would have been the most effective solution to change the regime, to open Hormuz, and to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons. Air and naval war cannot do that by themselves. In any case, the Iranian army was not as strong as Saddam's, but Iran's geography would have made that hard. We had, in early March, reports of operations by the Kurds, who said having thousands of fighters, but we had no news since. Iran's only true weapon is the Strait of Hormuz, which puts time on its side. Without this, the Americans could have stayed longer and would have more leeway. We have right now a ceasefire with negotiations. The ceasefire is not perfect, but honestly it's very hard in history to find a ceasefire without violence. Just look at the Balkans. For negotiations, Trump wants to get out of the conflict to help himself in the midterm elections, and proclaimed dozens of times an imminent accord. In parallel, he threatened Iran with partial or total destruction several dozen times during the conflict, mostly without carrying it out. Except that Iran will never abandon its nuclear program, especially after getting militarily humiliated. The regime managed to fool the world and the IAEA on its nuclear program and can do it again. And also, the obsession over destroying Israel is still present. The conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon complicates things. Hezbollah is Iran's extension, a practical tool to spread chaos, provoke an Israeli response in Lebanon, and draw international criticism. Even if the Americans get out of the conflict, Israel will want to achieve its objectives. In principle, Iran only has to survive to proclaim itself the winner, but the country is in very poor shape. It was already the case before the war, with water shortages. As I already mentioned, there are media reports often talking about missile shortages on one side or the other. We had, on the opposite, the Washington Post saying Iran still had 3/4 of its mobile launchers. Truth remains unknown, but one thing is sure, with the ceasefire, the Iranians rushed to re-establish their missile and drone capabilities. I didn't mention the long-term impact on oil. Several oil infrastructures in the region were put on halt by fear of Iranian strikes and cannot be restarted by a snap of the fingers. It takes a lot of time. Some others were damaged, so it would take even longer. One thing is sure, there will be a long-term impact on inflation. But as Trump wrote on June 1st, just sit back and relax, it will all work out well in the end. It always does. You may have noticed that the Gulf War of 1991 was not always perfect, but it was coherent, well led, with clear objectives, dedicated forces and preparations, a true coalition, and most of all objectives were achieved. It was the presence of clear objectives, effective communication, exhaustive preparations for all phases of the war which lacked for the war against Iran. It was led in Trump style, and the result goes with it. Well, this is the end of my video, I hope you enjoyed it. If so, don't hesitate to like and subscribe, and I'll see you around.